A little boy woke up one morning, and the sun was shining brightly, and he thought, "It's a perfect day to go fishing." His mother was baking bread in the kitchen. It smelled so good. He ran in to ask permission to go fishing, and his mother said he could, if he'd be sure to be home before the sun went down behind the hill. Then she popped 5 little loaves of bread in a sack. They weren't long loaves like we buy at the store. They were tiny, and you didn't eat a slice. You ate a whole loaf. "Now," the little boy's mother said, "go to the salt barrel and get some fish to go with the bread, and you'll have a nice lunch." The little boy lifted the lid of the barrel, reached into the salt brine, and pulled out 2 tiny fish, dropped them in the sack, kissed his mom goodbye, and was off to go fishing. But when he reached the street, he saw a big crowd of people gathered in the middle of town. And since the little boy had great curiosity, he headed for town instead of the fishing hole. Maybe there was a long, dead snake in the street, he thought. When he got to the crowd, he couldn't see a thing, 'cause he was too short to see over the people. So he had to scooch. Now all you boys and girls know how to scooch. You stand sideways and wiggle your shoulders and push, and the grown-ups will soon stand back and let you through. When the little boy had scooched his way into the middle of the crowd, he looked down to find the snake. But there was no dead snake. And then he looked around, and to his disgust he discovered the people were standing there listening to a man talk. He wanted to scooch right back out, but he decided he better wait a little while or the people might get mad at him. Before he knew it, he was listening to what the man was saying, and they were things the little boy had never heard before. Now the boy came from a good Jewish family, and they went to the temple to pray, and they made their sacrifice each year, and the little boy knew that if you were good, God would bless you, and if you disobeyed God, you would bring down his anger upon you. But as the little boy listened to the man, he was telling the people that God loved them, and he wanted them to love each other. And then he talked about a place God was preparing called heaven for all those who loved him and obeyed him. And the little boy had never heard of such things before, and soon he was listening intently to every word the man said. And when the man began to walk away, and the crowd followed, the little boy ran right along with them. And the man went up on a hillside out of the town, and all of the people sat down on the hillside, and the little boy was right on the front row, sitting cross-legged, and not missing a word. He forgot all about going fishing. Soon the sun was high overhead. "What time is it?"
12.
That's right. And it's time to eat. And I never knew a little boy in my life that could let noon go by without at least having a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. But our little boy had fallen in love with Jesus, and he even forgot to eat his lunch. The sun moved across the sky, and it was getting late in the afternoon, and Jesus turned to some of his helpers and said, "These people haven't had anything to eat all day. I don't want to send them home hungry. Let's find something in the crowd to feed them." "But, Master," his helpers said, "there are 5,000 men here, and that doesn't even count the women and children." Now, you boys and girls know that if your daddy brought 5 extra people home for Sunday dinner, your mom would have nervous prostration. And Jesus is talking about feeding 5,000. The little boy's close enough to hear what they're saying. And Jesus says, "Oh, there must be someone here with food." And without thinking one time about the hunger pangs in his own stomach, the little boy jumps up with his sack, tugs on a helper's robe, and hands him his lunch. And then the minute he did it, he knew it was a dumb thing to do. What's he got in that sack?
5 loaves and 2 tiny fish.
And how many men are on that hillside?
5,000.
That's right. And that doesn't count the women and children. And the little boy just knew that the master would pat him on the head and hand him back his sack and tell him thank you. But wait a minute. Jesus opened the sack. He asked the disciples to bring him 12 baskets, and then after blessing the little sack lunch, the master began to reach inside and break up a loaf of bread, filling one basket after another, until finally the baskets had been filled many, many times. And the little boy sat cross-legged, his eyes popped wide, and his heart beating so fast he thought it would burst right out of his shirt. His little lunch, his 5 loaves of bread and 2 tiny fish, had fed 5,000 men and all the women and children, including the little boy. And then he heard the master tell his disciples to collect the leftovers. Leftovers? How could there possibly be anything left? But there were 12 baskets left, one for each of the helpers. Oh, the little boy had fallen in love that day with the Lord Jesus Christ. He didn't have much to give him. What was in that sack?
5 loaves and 2 tiny fish.
That was all. And so the little boy had reached in the sack and pinched off a piece of bread and stuck it in his pocket, just in case he didn't get any, and the rest he gave to Jesus.
No.
Oh, well, let's see. He broke off the tail of a tiny fish and tucked it under his tongue, and he gave the rest to the Lord.
No.
Well, how much did he give him?
All of it.
That's right. Our little boy had given Jesus all he had. Oh, it wasn't much, but it was all he had to give. And the master took it and multiplied it many times over. Jesus Christ wants your life. Oh, it isn't much, but he asks that we give him all we have, and he's promised to multiply and use it to his glory. What is God's command and promise about giving?
Give, and it shall be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over.
Let me tell you a story about some very ungrateful people. God had been leading the Israelites through the wilderness. He'd been good to them, far beyond anything they deserved. He supplied their food and water, protected them from their enemies. Why, they didn't have to plant seeds, or water the fields, or harvest a crop. Every morning they took their baskets, stepped out of their tents, and picked up bread from heaven that God sent them. The Israelites called it manna. But after a while, if you can believe it, those ungrateful Israelites began to complain about God's food. I can just imagine a couple of children sitting down at the breakfast table one morning, and as mother sets the manna down, they say, "Ah, Mom, do we have to eat manna again? We're tired of eating manna." And I can imagine some housewife fixing lunch and saying, "Manna, manna, manna. That's all I ever have to fix. I wish I had some of those exotic foods from Egypt again." And at the supper table, a daddy says, "Manna? Again? That's all we ever have to eat around here." And God's feelings were hurt. And then he was angry at the ungrateful Israelites. And he punished them. One morning, the people woke up, and slithery, slimy serpents were everywhere. A young boy went to draw water, and over the rocks came a slithery, slimy serpent and bit him. He doubled up in pain, and in a little while he died. A daddy goes to get hay to feed the animals,
and as he scoops it up in his arms, out of the hay comes a fiery snake and bites him, and he dies. And a mother, cleaning up the tent, lifts up a rug to shake it, and from under it comes a slithery serpent and bites her toes, and soon she's dead. All over the camp, people by the hundreds were bitten and dying. And then the people began to wonder what they'd done to displease God. And they realized they'd been fussing about the food God sent them. And they were sorry. And they hurried to their leader Moses, and they cried, "Oh, Moses, Moses, you've just got to do something about these slithery, slimy serpents. Please tell God we're sorry we complained about the manna. We'll never complain again. Moses, if God doesn't stop these snakes, we'll all be dead. Please, Moses, beg God to forgive us." And Moses went to God and begged his forgiveness, and God forgave them. And he told Moses what to do about the snakes. God said for Moses to make a serpent out of brass and set it on top of a very high pole, and put the pole right in the middle of the Israelite camp where everyone could see it. And then, when someone was bitten by a serpent, all they had to do was look up at the brass serpent on the pole, and they'd be well. Moses did as God said, and when the brass serpent was finished, he put it on a pole high enough to be seen from anywhere in the camp of Israel. And all the people were told to look at the serpent shining in the sun, and their snake bite would be healed. Now let's pretend again. A little boy and his baby sister are outside, playing in the sand, and from under a bush comes a slithery, slimy snake, and before the baby sister even sees it, it bites the little girl. She begins to cry, and her brother calls their mother, and the mommy grabs the little girl up in her arms, points to the serpent on the pole, and cries, "Look, darling, look, see the snake shining in the sun?" And when the little girl looks, it doesn't hurt any more. The snake bite is well. All over the camp, those who accept God's cure and look at the brass serpent are immediately healed. Now, while we're pretending, let's pretend it's the next day, and it's early in the morning. Dawn is just beginning to streak the sky, and a daddy who's big and strong and stubborn is asleep in his bedroll, and his wife calls, "Breakfast is ready." And the daddy opens one eye and yawns and opens the other eye, and then he's frozen with fear. Creeping closer and closer from the foot of his bedroll is one of the snakes. If he jumps, the snake is sure to strike, and if he stays there, he knows it will get him. He can see the black, beady eyes of the snake, and its tongue darting in and out as it slithers closer and closer, and finally he can't stand it any longer, and he jumps from the bedroll, and he's bitten. He grabs his leg and calls for his wife to come quickly. "I've been bitten," he cries. "Tie a tourniquet around my leg, quickly." "But, honey," his wife says, "there's no need to do that. Come outside the tent and look up at the brass serpent Moses made. You'll be fine." "Don't talk nonsense, woman. Looking at a serpent on the pole can't help me. Hurry. Don't just stand there. Tie my leg." "Oh, please," the wife begs. "The little girl in the tent next to us was bitten, and she looked at the snake, and she's fine. And the man across from us was bitten, and he looked, and he's well. I'll help you to the door." But even though she begs, he refuses. Looking at a serpent is no cure for snake bite. And he lies down on his bedroll and dies because he refused God's cure. How sad. If only he'd believed God, he could have lived. But do you know, boys and girls, there are people all over the world who argue about God's cure for sin. They say, I don't see how getting all wet can wash away my sins. That's silly. I'll get to heaven without being baptized. But what was one of the last things Jesus told us before he went back to heaven?
He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be damned.
Men are dying in sin with no hope of heaven because they refuse to accept God's cure.
Boys and girls, this is a story that Jesus himself told. There was once a man that was very wealthy. He had everything anyone could possibly want. A big house, fine clothes, servants, and all kinds of good food to eat. But this man lied and cheated and stole to get his money, and all he thought about was gaining material wealth. He never took time to go to the temple and pray, never had time to help others, never thought about God. Each night he sat down to a sumptuous meal, and after his supper the table was cleared, and the servants would gather up the scraps and take them to the back door. Waiting at the back gate were all the stray dogs in the neighborhood, and when the servants would throw the leftover food out, the dogs would rush hungrily, growling and snarling, and gobble up their supper. Also at the gate each night was a poor old beggar. His legs were covered with sores, open, runny sores. Children, you know that if you have a skinned knee and a dog comes along, he'll lick it. And the dogs licked the old beggar's sores. His clothes were worn and tattered, and the only food he had was what he got at the rich man's door. But he never thought of stealing food to satisfy his hunger. He had no home, no one to care about him. But he remembered to go to the temple and pray. He never cheated anyone or lied, and he even waited until the dogs were fed before he took scraps for himself. One night, the servant went to the back door as usual to throw out the scraps, and the dogs grabbed hungrily at them. But as the servant peered into the darkness, he didn't see the old beggar. Where could he be? Maybe he was sick. The servant told the others the old beggar was missing. Oh, don't worry, they said. He'll be back tomorrow night. Again, the beggar didn't come. I'm worried about the old man, the servant told the others. That's 2 nights in a row he hasn't come. He may be sick and need help. I know I ought to try and find him. I think he sleeps in a cave on the edge of town. It's out by the leper camp. Oh, you better not go out there, the others said. It's dark and dangerous this time of night. He'll be back tomorrow. You worry too much. It was late and awfully dark. The servant decided to wait one more night. But the old beggar wasn't there the 3rd night either. This time the servant had kept back the best scraps, and lighting a torch he set out into the night to try to find the old beggar. He walked through the dark streets of town to the outskirts of the desert. Up ahead he saw the cave. He held his torch high and peered into the dark mouth of the cave. He couldn't see anything, so he called out, "Old man, are you there?" No answer. He called again. "Old man, are you there? It's a servant from the rich man's house. I've brought you some food." But still there was no answer. He was scared to, but he guessed he'd have to go in the cave. Holding the torch high to chase the shadows, he took a few steps inside. Was that a bundle of rags he saw back in the corner? He took a few more steps, and he knew it wasn't rags. It was the old beggar. And the servant knew the beggar was dead. The stench inside the cave was awful. The beggar had been dead for 3 days, and his body had begun to rot and decay, and the servant felt sick at his stomach, and he rushed out into the night and gulped the fresh air. And then he felt miserably ashamed and sad. The old beggar had needed help, but there'd been no one to care, and he died all alone. If only I'd come the first night, the servant thought. Maybe I could have saved his life. Well, the least he could do was pile stones over the cave entrance. And that was all the burial the old beggar got. And the servant went sadly back to his own home. Time passed, and soon they all had forgotten about the old man with the sores who'd come to eat with the dogs. The rich man went right on making money, cheating, lying, stealing, with no thought for God or his fellow men. And then one night, when the rich man had stuffed himself with an especially big supper, and the servants were clearing the table, suddenly the rich man sighed, grabbed his chest, and fell over in a heap, dead. The servants rushed to him, rubbed his wrists and slapped his cheeks and tried to rouse him. But it was no use. He was dead. When the beggar died, only one person was present for his funeral. But when the rich man died, the whole town turned out. They wrapped his body in white linen, poured sweet perfume over it, and placed it on a funeral bier. And as they paraded through the streets with his body, the rich man had the longest funeral procession the town had ever seen. But when the rich man came to, his mouth was dry and parched, and his tongue was so swollen he could hardly swallow, and his lips were chapped and sore, and he was hot and tormented. He began to look around, and he missed his big house, and his servants, and his lovely clothes. And where was his money? Why, his pockets were empty. Way off in the distance, he saw a green valley with trees and a beautiful clear stream of water. It looked so cool and peaceful. And then he saw 2 fellows sitting in the shade of a tree. One of them looked familiar. Now, where had he seen that man before? Why, that was the old beggar, the fellow that used to come to his back gate at night and eat with the dogs. Let's see, Lazarus was his name. Why, many a scrap was thrown to him from my table, the rich man thought. And that looks like Abraham sitting with him. "Say, Abraham," the rich man called, "I think I know that fellow with you. That's the beggar Lazarus. Would you send him over with a drop of cool water from that stream? Boy, am I thirsty." "Why, I'm afraid that's impossible," Abraham replied. "Don't you see that great chasm between us? There's no way for him to get to you, and you can't come to us." "Well," the rich man asked, "why is he so cool and comfortable while I'm in misery?" "You should know the answer to that," Abraham said. "Lazarus had nothing but miseries on earth, but he remembered God, and now he has his reward.
and you had everything money could buy, and you never thought about God. So now you have your reward.
You mean I'm here because of the way I lived on earth? The rich man asked.
That's right, Abraham said.
This is awful. I must do something. I have brothers and sisters that are living just like I did. I must warn them somehow. I know. Send Lazarus back to tell them to change their ways. I don't want them to suffer like I am.
There's no need for Lazarus to go back, Abraham said. They have priests and preachers and prophets to warn them.
Oh, I know. I had priests and prophets too, but I didn't listen, and they won't either.
But if someone comes back from the dead, then they'll listen. No, Abraham said sadly. Someone will come back from the dead, and he'll warn them, but they won't listen. Boys and girls, who came back from the dead to warn us?
Jesus.
Yes, and he said, except ye repent, ye shall all likewise perish. What else did Jesus tell us about the way to live this life?
Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you.
Hundreds and hundreds of years have passed since Jesus told this story. Where is the rich man today?
In hell.
That's right. For hundreds of years he's lived in torment in hell. And he has an eternity in hell stretching in front of him. Where is Lazarus today?
In heaven.
Oh, yes. The beggar's in heaven, with an eternity of companionship with God ahead of him.
Let me tell you a story about a battle that was fought backwards. Oh, I don't mean the soldiers marched backwards. I mean they went about the battle backwards. Oh, well, let me just tell it and you'll understand. God had a very special job that needed doing, and as he often does, he picked a young man to do it. The Midianites had been enemies of the Israelites for many years. They just made life miserable. And God decided to help the Israelites. And he chose a young man to lead them in battle against the enemy. God told the young man to call all the Israelites together. So trumpets were blown and messengers were sent out until all the Israelite people were gathered together in one place. And then the young man counted out all the able-bodied men to be his soldiers. And when he'd finished counting his army, he had 32,000 men. That was a pretty good group. And the young man was feeling quite brave about fighting the Midianites. And then God said, "Gideon, you have too many men. Send all those who are scared back home with the women and children." Oh my! Gideon didn't think that was a very good idea. But he did as God told him. And he sent all those who were chicken and all of those who had yellow streaks down their back home. When Gideon finished counting, he only had 10,000 men left. He wasn't feeling quite so brave now. And then God said, "Gideon, you still have too many men."
"Too many?" Gideon said. "But the Midianites number like the sands of the sea, Lord."
"I know," God said, "but some of these men will not make good soldiers. Send them down to the stream to get a drink, and send all those who take off their swords and put their faces in the water home. They won't make good soldiers. Keep only the ones who keep their swords on, get down on one knee, and lap up the water in their hands. They'll make alert soldiers." Gideon did as God said, and he sent the men to get a drink. At first it looked like all of them got down on both knees. And then Gideon spotted one fella doing it right. And oh, there was another. And there were two over there, and oh, good, there was one more. And when Gideon counted the men he had left, there were only a measly 300. That was no army. Gideon was wishing he'd never gotten into this. The truth is, Gideon was scared. And God knew it. So he told Gideon, with his servant, to creep down to the edge of the Midianite camp and listen. Gideon waited till it was very dark, and then quietly he and his servant made their way down the hill to the edge of the camp. The camp was still. All the men were in their tents sleeping. The fire was just a few smoldering embers. Even the guards dozed. And then suddenly, some fella came running out of his tent, shouting and pulling his hair, and he woke the whole camp up. And when they finally got the fella quieted down and asked him what was wrong, he said, "Oh, it's terrible, it's awful. I had a nightmare. I dreamed we were all asleep in our tents, and a huge cake of barley came rolling down that hill and into our camp and just crushed my tent. You know who that is, don't you?" And everyone nodded solemnly. "It's those Israelites and that God of theirs. Oh, we're doomed for sure." And it was all Gideon could do to keep from laughing right out loud. Why, those silly Midianites were really scared. And Gideon only had 300 men. Well, Gideon was feeling much better. And he crept quietly back to his camp. And he gathered his men, and he told them God's plan. Each man had an earthen pitcher. Not a clear one you can see through like your mom pours Kool-Aid out of, but solid. And inside they were to put a torch. Now the light would only shine out of the top of the pitcher. And each man had a trumpet. Those were strange things to fight a battle with, don't you think? Then Gideon divided the men. He sent 100 down on the left side of the Midianite camp, and another 100 tiptoed quietly down on the right-hand side. And Gideon took the last 100 and lined them up across the back side of the enemy camp. And then he told the men, when everyone was in place, that he'd shout, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon is upon you." And then he said, "You must stand, shout the same thing, break the pitchers, blow the trumpets, and then rush the Midianite camp." Soon everyone was in place. 100 had tiptoed quietly down on the left side. Another 100 had quietly lined up on the right side. And the last 100 were lined up across the back. And when everyone was quiet and still, Gideon shouted, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon is upon you!" And the men broke their pitchers and flashed their torches and blew their trumpets and rushed the camp. And the Midianites woke with a start to all that noise. And it scared them so badly they rushed out of their tents and ran so hard and fast to get away from the Israelites they killed each other, trying to escape. What few got away didn't bother the Israelites again for many, many years. Now let's see. Gideon won the battle because he was a very brave soldier.
No.
Oh, well, let me see. He won the battle because he had a small but a very well-trained army.
No.
Of course not. Gideon didn't win the battle. God did. God used psychological warfare. Oh, we think we're so smart and that only in our day has that weapon been discovered. But hundreds of years ago, God used psychological warfare on the Midianites. Why, the Midianites were scared to death as a result of a dream God implanted in the mind of one of their men. And the battle was won before it ever started. God never asks us to take on a task that's more difficult than the strength and the power He intends to give us to perform it.